There is a Sunday morning in Florence, in the spring of 1478, when the most beautiful building in the world becomes the site of a murder. The men who walk into the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore that morning are not strangers. They are Florentines. Some of them have eaten dinner at the table of the man they have come to kill. One of them was a guest in his home the week before, sitting in the same courtyard, listening to the same musicians play at dusk, accepting the same wine from the same servants who would, by the end of this day, be mourning. They enter the cathedral with knives hidden beneath their formal clothing. The signal is the ringing of the Sanctus bell. Giuliano de' Medici is 25 years old on the morning he dies. He receives the first blow before he understands what is happening. 19 more follow. He falls on the stone floor of the cathedral and does not rise. His brother Lorenzo is wounded in the neck. He does not fall. He runs, locks himself in the sacristy, and waits in the dark to hear what Florence will do next. What he hears is not what the conspirators expected. Florence does not celebrate. The people do not open their windows and call the assassins liberators. They do not pull the Medici symbols from the public buildings or name this morning the beginning of their freedom. Instead, they go into the streets and defend the family that had just been attacked in their most sacred space. The Archbishop of Pisa, who coordinated the murder inside a house of God, is captured and hanged from the window of the city hall before the day is over. A family of bankers, no royal title, no army, no divine right, and the city bleeds for them anyway. Why? That is the only question this film exists to answer. And the answer will change the way you see every museum, every university, every foundation, and every act of public generosity you encounter for the rest of your life. Chapter 1. The city that invented itself. To understand what the Medici built, you have to first understand the city they built it in. Florence, in the early 1400s, was not simply a place. It was an argument, a living, frequently violent argument about what kind of society was actually possible, about who deserved power and on what grounds, about whether the world that had existed for 1,000 years under the authority of kings and inherited titles was the only world that could exist, or whether something genuinely different might be constructed by people willing to try. Most of medieval Europe had settled that argument before it started. Power came from God, expressed through the church, delegated to kings, inherited by their sons. The system was not fair. It was not designed to be fair. It was designed to be stable, and for centuries, by the standards available to it. It was. Florence had a different answer, not a cleaner answer, not a more just answer in practice, but a structurally different one that created conditions no other major European city had produced in quite the same way. Florence was a republic. The word requires immediate qualification, because it did not mean what the modern world means by it. There were no universal elections, no guaranteed rights, no protection for the poorest residents against the decisions of the wealthiest. What Florence had was a system of guilds, 21 of them, organized by trade and profession, that controlled access to political office, economic participation, and civic standing. If you were a member of a guild in good standing, you had a path, however narrow and however contested, toward political relevance. In Venice, old, noble families controlled the republic and had done so for generations. Their names inscribed in a register that defined who could hold power and who could not. In Milan, a duke ruled with the authority of a military conqueror. In Rome, the Pope sat at the center of a spiritual empire that claimed authority over the souls of every Christian in Europe. In all of these places, the question of who deserved power had been answered before you arrived. In Florence, the answer was written in wool. The wool trade was the economic foundation of the city. The merchants who controlled it were among the most influential people in the Republic, not because of their ancestry or a title granted by a king, but because of what they produced, what they traded, and what they understood about money. This created something unusual, a city where commercial success could translate, imperfectly and with enormous friction, into political standing, a city where a family with enough intelligence, enough capital, and enough patience might climb a hierarchy that was not entirely closed to them simply because of the name they carried. Into this city, in 1360, a man named Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici was born. He was not remarkable in the way that founders of dynasties are supposed to be remarkable. He was careful. He was quiet. He had an instinct for financial risk that expressed itself not as boldness but as precision. The ability to see where other people's calculations had failed, and to position himself in the space their failure created. He built the Medici Bank from a modest operation into the most important financial institution in Florence. Not through dramatic strokes of genius, but through the accumulation of correct small decisions made over a very long time. He made one decision. However, that was neither small nor accidental. He made the Medici Bank the primary financial agent of the papacy. The Catholic Church in the early 1400s was, among other things, the largest financial institution in Europe. It collected taxes from every Catholic community on the continent. It needed to move money across borders that political conflicts made dangerous, to convert currencies that no government had standardized, to maintain accounts in cities where it had no direct presence. Giovanni looked at that problem and understood it as an opportunity. The Medici Bank became the mechanism through which the papacy managed its European finances, and that relationship signaled to every other potential client in Europe that the Medici were operating at a scale that smaller institutions could not approach. When Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici died, in 1429, he left his son Cosimo two things. The first was the most profitable banking operation in Europe. The second was a principle, stated quietly, in the way that the most important lessons are usually delivered. Do not make yourself a target. Make yourself necessary. Cosimo heard that principle. He understood it in the way that only people who have watched others fail, by ignoring it, can truly understand it. And he would spend the next 30 years translating it into something his father had never imagined and the world had never seen. But before Cosimo could build anything, Florence had to teach him the most important lesson of his life. It did so by throwing him out. In 1433, the Albizzi family, rivals of the Medici who had grown alarmed at the pace of Cosimo's rising influence, succeeded in having him arrested on charges of attempting to elevate himself above his proper station in the Republic. The charges were political, which in Florence meant they were serious without necessarily being true. Cosimo was tried, convicted, and sentenced to exile. He left for Venice, carrying his money, his contacts, and his very careful attention to what had just happened and why. He was gone for 1 year. What happened in Florence during that year was not dramatic. It was quiet, and the quiet was the point. The financial networks that Cosimo maintained began to function less smoothly without his direct management. The relationships he had built with institutions across Europe did not transfer automatically to his rivals. The specific combination of trust, information, and capability that the Medici operation represented turned out to be, in his absence, genuinely difficult to replace. Florence did not collapse without Cosimo, but it became, in measurable ways, less capable. In 1434, the political winds shifted. The Albizzi overreached. Cosimo was invited to return. He came back to Florence, not as a conqueror, not with an army or a declaration or a public ceremony designed to announce his triumph. He came back quietly, the way he had always operated, and resumed his position in the city with the same visible modesty he had maintained before his exile. But everyone in Florence understood what the year had demonstrated. The city needed him more than he needed the city. That understanding, that single shift in the perceived balance of dependence, was the foundation on which everything that followed was built. Not the banking, not the art, not the philosophy. The moment Florence learned that it could not function as well without the Medici as the Medici could function without Florence, Cosimo de' Medici returned to Florence in 1434. He never held the title of ruler. He never sat on a throne, or wore a crown, or issued commands in the name of a sovereign authority that was formerly his. He simply, from that year until his death 30 years later, never lost again. And in those 30 years, he built something that had no name yet, because it had not existed before. Chapter 2. Cosimo's Invisible Architecture. In the winter of 1434, a few months after Cosimo returned from exile, he received a design proposal for a new family palace from Filippo Brunelleschi, the greatest architect in Florence and the man who had built the dome that defined the city's skyline. Cosimo rejected it, not because the design was poor, because it was too grand, too visible, too clearly the statement of a man who wanted the world to know how far he had risen. Cosimo had already been exiled once by men who felt that a Medici had risen too far. He had no intention of giving them the same justification again. What he commissioned instead, from a different architect named Michelozzo, was a palace that was large without being aggressive, refined without being ostentatious, impressive in its proportions but careful in its statement. The Palazzo Medici, which still stands in Florence today, says precisely what Cosimo wanted it to say, and nothing more. We have arrived. We do not intend to dominate. That distinction, so fine that most people who walked past the building never consciously registered it, was the operating principle of everything Cosimo built for the rest of his life. He had understood something about power that very few people in his position had grasped before him. Visible power invites resistance, power that expresses itself as service, as contribution, as the quiet provision of things that people genuinely need, generates something different. It generates dependence that does not feel like dependence. It generates loyalty that does not feel like loyalty to a patron, but like pride in a shared achievement. It generates a situation in which the people who benefit from your influence defend it as if it were their own. Because in a meaningful sense, it has become their own. This was the system Cosimo intended to build. And the first instrument he reached for was not art. It was banking. The Medici Bank that Cosimo inherited from his father was already the most important financial institution in Florence. Under Cosimo, it became something structurally larger. By the 1440s, it had branches in Rome, Venice, Milan, Geneva, Bruges, and London. Each branch was managed by a local partner who shared in the profits and the risks, who had every incentive to perform well and no easy mechanism for betraying the central operation without destroying his own position in the process. Cosimo had thought carefully about the failure modes of financial institutions, which in 15th century Europe failed constantly and catastrophically. The great Florentine banking houses of the previous century, the Bardi and the Peruzzi, had collapsed because they had extended enormous unsecured loans to the King of England to finance his wars in France. And when the king could not repay, the banks could not absorb the loss. Cosimo drew the lesson carefully. The Medici Bank would manage its exposure, diversify its operations across enough cities and enough industries that no single default, however large, could bring the entire structure down. He was building a risk-distributed network. In the 1440s, with ledgers and letters and partners connected by roads that took weeks to travel. But the banking operation, extraordinary as it was, is the context for what this chapter is actually about. Because somewhere in the first decade after his return from exile, Cosimo de' Medici began spending money in a way that his contemporaries noticed but could not entirely explain. He began commissioning buildings, Not private buildings for the family's use. Public buildings, churches, libraries, convents, spaces that belonged, in some meaningful sense, to Florence rather than to him. He financed the reconstruction of the Basilica of San Lorenzo, the oldest church in Florence. He built the Library of San Marco, the first public library in Europe since antiquity, a space where any scholar could come and read, without paying and without permission. He contributed to the completion of Brunelleschi's dome, the engineering achievement that would define the Florence skyline for the next 6 centuries. The total expenditure on these projects was staggering. Cosimo himself, late in his life, calculated his spending on buildings and charitable works over his lifetime and arrived at a number so large that the family biographer who recorded it paused to note that it troubled even Cosimo. His recorded response was characteristic. What troubled him was not the money spent, but whether he had spent enough to secure the honor of God and the reputation of his house. Note the pairing, the honor of God, and the reputation of his house. Not one or the other. Both, in the same breath, as if they were naturally connected. This is the moment to ask the question that the myth of Cosimo as pure cultural benefactor tends to obscure. Why was he doing this? The easy answer is that Cosimo was a man of genuine piety and genuine cultural passion, that he loved learning, that his patronage was an expression of his character rather than a calculation of his interests. This answer is not entirely wrong. The historical record suggests that Cosimo did read, that he had genuine intellectual curiosity, that his support of scholars and artists was not purely transactional. But the easy answer is incomplete in ways that matter. Cosimo de' Medici was a man who had been exiled for the crime of being too powerful. He had returned from that exile with a precise understanding of the mechanisms by which political rivals justified destroying their competitors. Those mechanisms almost always ran through the same channel: the claim that someone had risen above their proper station, had accumulated more power than was legitimate, had become a threat to the Republic that needed to be removed. He could not stop being powerful, but he could change the form that power took. He could shift it from the kind of power that made rivals feel threatened to the kind that made the city feel grateful. The Library of San Marco did not threaten anyone. It gave scholars a place to work. It gave Florence something to be proud of. It attached the name of Medici to an act of generosity so clearly beneficial that criticizing it would have required criticizing learning itself. The reconstruction of San Lorenzo did not threaten anyone. It gave Florence a more beautiful church. It attached the name of Medici to an act of piety so publicly visible that questioning it would have required questioning devotion itself. This was the system, not cynical in the way that word usually implies, not cold and calculated in a way that excluded genuine feeling, but strategic in the deepest sense. Cosimo was building a position that his enemies could not attack without attacking the things that Florence valued most. He was making the Medici name synonymous with the city's best version of itself, and then he reached for the instrument that would make the system permanent. He reached for ideas. In 1439, the Council of Florence brought together representatives of the Eastern and Western Christian churches in an attempt to heal the Great Schism. Among the delegates from Constantinople was a philosopher named Gemistus Pletho, one of the most significant Platonic scholars of his era, who brought with him Greek texts, the actual writings of Plato, which had been largely unavailable in Western Europe since the fall of Rome, which existed in the West mostly as second-hand references and incomplete translations. Cosimo attended the council sessions. He met Pletho. He listened. What Cosimo did next reveals something essential about the way his mind worked. He found a young scholar named Marsilio Ficino, the son of his personal physician, recognized in him an unusual combination of linguistic ability and philosophical appetite, and made him a proposition. Cosimo would provide Ficino with a house, an income, and access to the Greek manuscripts that the Medici were beginning to collect. Ficino would learn Greek, translate Plato into Latin, and establish in Florence what Cosimo called an academy. The Platonic Academy of Florence was not a building. It was a gathering. Philosophers, poets, artists, and civic leaders meeting regularly at the Medici villa outside the city walls, to discuss ideas in a setting where the boundary between serious philosophical inquiry and pleasurable conversation was deliberately blurred, where the most important thinkers of the era sat at a table that Cosimo had set, in a room that Cosimo had furnished, speaking a language that Cosimo had made possible. What those conversations produced, over the next several decades, was a philosophy that the world would come to call Renaissance humanism. That philosophy argued that human beings were not merely fallen creatures awaiting redemption, that the earthly world was not simply a vale of tears to be endured on the way to heaven, that beauty, reason, and civic virtue were genuinely valuable in themselves, that the merchant who built libraries and churches and supported scholars was not merely seeking earthly reputation, but expressing the highest capacities of human nature. That Florence, with its commercial energy and its patronage of the arts, was not a compromise with the spiritual ideal, but an embodiment of it. The philosophy produced by the institution Cosimo funded said, in the most sophisticated intellectual language available, that people like Cosimo deserved the position they held. Now, did Cosimo fund the Platonic Academy because he believed in its ideas? Or did he believe in its ideas because they justified what he was already doing? Or were those two things so deeply intertwined in the mind of a man, as intelligent and as self-aware as Cosimo de' Medici, that separating them was not possible even for him? The historical record will not answer that question cleanly. What it will answer is this. By the time Cosimo de' Medici died, in 1464, Florence had a public library. It had a philosophical academy producing ideas that would reshape European intellectual life for the next 2 centuries. It had churches and monasteries that bore the Medici name as gifts to the city's spiritual life. It had a banking network connecting it to the financial systems of half a dozen countries. And it had, in the Palazzo Medici, a private residence that had become one of the most significant cultural centers in Europe, where artists worked and scholars debated, and political decisions were made in the course of conversations that were officially just dinner. And Florence had given Cosimo de' Medici a title it had not given to any private citizen since the Roman Republic. Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, the same title given to Cicero, the same title given to Caesar, not to a king, not to a general, not to a saint, to a banker's son from Florence who had understood, before anyone else in his world had found the language to say it, that the most durable form of power was not the power to command, it was the power to be the reason a city was proud of itself. Chapter 3. The Magnificent Illusion. There is a portrait of Lorenzo de' Medici that has become one of the most reproduced images of the Renaissance. Lorenzo stands in 3/4 profile, his expression composed and unreadable, his eyes carrying the particular quality that skilled portrait painters give to subjects. They want to appear as though they are thinking something important they have chosen not to say. It is a magnificent portrait. It is also almost certainly not an accurate likeness. Contemporary accounts of Lorenzo's appearance were consistent in noting that he was, by the standards of his era and his station, physically unimpressive. His nose was flat and broad. His complexion was dark. His voice was harsh and nasal, the result of a sinus condition that affected him throughout his life. Machiavelli, who grew up in the Florence that Lorenzo had shaped, wrote that nature had been unkind to him in matters of appearance, and yet Lorenzo de' Medici became, within his own lifetime, the most celebrated figure in Europe. Poets wrote about him. Philosophers dedicated their works to him. Ambassadors from Naples, from Milan, from Rome, from the Ottoman Empire sought his counsel on matters of statecraft, as if he held a formal office that he technically did not possess. When he walked through Florence, People stopped, not out of fear, out of genuine admiration. How does a man who is not physically impressive, who holds no royal title, who commands no army, who is technically a private citizen of a republic, become the figure around whom an entire civilization organizes its sense of what excellence looks like? The answer begins with something Cosimo gave Lorenzo that no amount of money could have purchased directly: time. Lorenzo de' Medici grew up inside the system his grandfather built. He did not have to construct it, did not have to fight for it, against the resistance of a world that did not yet accept it. He inherited it fully formed, which meant that the energy Cosimo had spent building the architecture, Lorenzo could spend inhabiting it completely, exploring its possibilities, pushing it toward things that a first-generation builder cannot reach, because first-generation builders are always fighting the resistance of the new. Lorenzo was educated by the finest minds the Platonic Academy had produced. He studied Greek and Latin not as preparation for some future use, but as daily practice. He wrote poetry in the Tuscan vernacular at a time when serious literary work was still expected to appear in Latin. And his poetry was good enough that scholars, 4 centuries later, would still be reading it as literature rather than as historical curiosity. He played musical instruments. He composed songs. He organized the festivals that Florence celebrated with a theatricality and an attention to spectacle that transformed civic ceremony into something closer to art. He was, in other words, the thing that Cosimo had been working toward, without quite being able to name it. He was the living argument that the Medici project made. The argument was this: the highest form of human achievement is not military conquest or inherited title or the accumulation of wealth for its own sake. It is the cultivation of all of the capacities that make human life worth living. The ability to think clearly, to feel deeply, to create beauty, to govern wisely, to engage with ideas seriously, to understand the world in its complexity and respond to it with both intelligence and grace. The humanist philosophers of the Platonic Academy had been making that argument for a generation. And here, walking through the streets of Florence, writing the poems, commissioning the paintings, mediating the political crises with a combination of shrewdness and apparent effortlessness, was their argument made flesh. Lorenzo did not perform this, or rather, he performed it so completely that the performance became indistinguishable from the person. Consider what it actually required. In 1471, 2 years after Lorenzo took control of Florentine affairs, he travelled to Milan as the representative of Florence to celebrate the accession of a new duke. He was 22 years old. He arrived with a retinue calculated to impress without threatening, culturally sophisticated in ways that communicated to the Milanese court that Florence was a place of serious achievement rather than mere commercial prosperity. He brought gifts. He brought musicians. He brought the kind of conversation that powerful people are rarely offered, which is the conversation of someone genuinely interested in ideas and genuinely capable of discussing them at the level the situation requires. He returned from Milan with something more valuable than any treaty. He returned with the understanding, confirmed by direct experience, that the cultural prestige his grandfather had built was a form of political currency that could be spent in rooms where Florence had no formal standing and no military leverage. He spent the next 20 years spending it. Sandro Botticelli, Angelo Poliziano, Pico della Mirandola, Leonardo da Vinci. The list of artists and scholars who worked under Lorenzo's patronage reads, from the distance of 6 centuries, like a catalogue of the Renaissance itself. And Michelangelo, Buonarroti, Michelangelo, enters the Medici household in 1490. When he is 15 years old, Lorenzo has noticed him working in the sculpture garden near the monastery of San Marco, a place where young artists could study classical sculpture from the Medici collection. What Lorenzo does next is the detail that matters most. He does not hire Michelangelo as a craftsman. He invites him into the household as a member of it. Michelangelo eats at the family table. He is introduced to the philosophers and poets of the Platonic Academy. He is treated, from the beginning, as something that no artist in the European tradition had previously been treated as by someone of Lorenzo's standing, as a genius. This word, in the 15th century, carried a specific weight. It described a kind of inspired creativity that connected the person who possessed it to something larger than ordinary human capacity. To call someone a genius was to make a claim about their relationship to the divine. Lorenzo made that claim about a 15-year-old sculptor from a stone carver's family, and in doing so, he changed not only Michelangelo's life, but the category itself. Before Lorenzo, artists in Europe were craftsmen. They were paid for their skill the way a carpenter was paid. They executed commissions according to specifications, and their social standing reflected their trade. After what Lorenzo modeled in his treatment of Michelangelo and others, the artist began to occupy a different position in the cultural imagination of Europe. The artist became someone whose inner vision was part of what was being purchased, whose name deserved to be remembered alongside the patrons rather than subordinate to it. That transformation is still unfolding today every time we put an artist's name on a museum wall or celebrate a filmmaker as a creative visionary rather than a skilled technician. But Lorenzo was not operating entirely from generosity. Consider what the Medici patronage of Botticelli actually produced. The Birth of Venus, painted around 1484, depicts the goddess Venus emerging from the sea, blown towards shore by the winds, received by the figures of the season. It is painted in a style that draws on classical mythology rather than Christian iconography, placing a nude female figure at the center of a major work of art in a way that had not been done in Western European painting since antiquity. This was not simply an aesthetic choice. It was a cultural statement of the first order. In commissioning a major painting centered on classical mythology rather than Christian narrative, Lorenzo was saying, in the language of images that everyone could see, and that required no Latin to understand, that beauty needed no theological justification, that the human form was worthy of celebration in itself, that a city which understood this was a city that had grasped something true about the world, and the city that had grasped this truth was Florence. And Florence was the Medici. The claim was never made that directly. It did not need to be. The painting made it. The sculpture garden made it. The academy made it. The festivals made it. The accumulated weight of 30 years of cultural production. All of it connected by the same invisible thread to the family that had funded and shaped and inhabited it. Made it so thoroughly that by the 1480s, the connection between Florence's greatness and the Medici's stewardship of that greatness had become, for most Florentines, simply a fact about the world rather than an argument that anyone had constructed. That is the most complete form of the system working as designed. When the argument becomes invisible because it has been accepted as reality, you have won something that no military campaign can secure and no political alliance can guarantee. You have won the story. Now return to the morning of April 26th, 1478. Return to the cathedral. Return to the Sanctus bell. Return to Giuliano dead on the floor and Lorenzo bleeding in the sacristy. We began there. We have spent 2 chapters earning the right to understand it. The Pazzi conspiracy was not, at its deepest level, a political assassination. It was a recognition by the people who organized it that the Medici had achieved something that could not be dismantled by ordinary political competition. You could not out-argue Lorenzo in the councils of Florence because the terms of the argument were ones he had helped define. You could not outspend him in the patronage of culture because the cultural infrastructure of the city already bore his family's imprint. You could not challenge his legitimacy by pointing to his lack of royal title, because he had spent 20 years demonstrating that his kind of legitimacy was worth more than royal titles. The only thing left was to remove him physically. And when that failed, when Lorenzo emerged from the sacristy and the city showed where it stood, the conspiracy did not merely fail, it demonstrated, more clearly than any success could have, the depth of what 3 generations of Medici had built. You cannot kill soft power by killing the people who hold it. Because by the time it is fully operational, it is no longer held by those people. It is held by everyone who has accepted the story. Pope Sixtus IV found himself at war with Florence as a result of the conspiracy's failure, a war he had not wanted and could not win cleanly. The Pazzi were expelled from Florence. Their name was erased from public inscriptions. Their assets were confiscated. And Lorenzo de' Medici, who had begun the year as the most powerful private citizen in Florence, ended it as something closer to what he had always been in practice, but had never quite been in name, the undisputed centre of the Florentine world. He would hold that position for 14 more years, until his death in 1492. Those 14 years are the years that history calls the golden age of the Florentine Renaissance. Lorenzo de' Medici did not create all of that, but he created the conditions in which all of that became possible, and he understood, more clearly than anyone else in his world, that creating conditions is a more powerful act than creating objects. Objects can be destroyed. Condition, if built deeply enough into the way a civilization understands itself, are far more durable. He was 43 years old when he died. He left behind a city transformed, a cultural legacy that would outlast every political structure of his era by centuries, and a son named Piero who had grown up in the completed version of the Medici world and had absorbed its comforts without absorbing its disciplines. The system that Cosimo had built from nothing, that Lorenzo had brought to its highest expression, was about to meet the test that every system eventually faces, the test of what happens when the person holding it is not equal to what they are holding. Chapter 4. What patronage actually was. There is a fresco on the walls of the Palazzo Medici that most visitors walk past without stopping. It was painted by Benozzo Gozzoli in 1459, commissioned by Cosimo, and it depicts the journey of the Magi, the 3 wise men travelling from the east to pay homage to the newborn Christ. It is a religious painting. It hangs in a chapel. It shows a biblical scene that every Christian in Florence would have recognized immediately as an expression of devotion. Look more carefully. The faces in the procession are not anonymous. They are portraits. The young king, riding at the head of the cavalcade, magnificent, on a white horse, dressed in clothing of extraordinary richness, is Lorenzo de' Medici, painted when he was approximately 10 years old. Behind him, also identifiable, are other members of the Medici family and their allies. Cosimo himself appears, riding a mule with the deliberate modesty that was his public signature, positioned in the procession in a way that placed him in the company of kings traveling to honor the Son of God, a biblical narrative, a devotional image, a chapel painting, and inside it, disguised as reverence, a claim about the Medici family's place in the divine order of things. This is what this chapter is about, not the beauty of what the Medici built. That beauty is real, and this film has spent 3 chapters doing justice to it. This chapter is about the mechanism underneath the beauty, the specific way in which the system of cultural patronage that Cosimo designed and Lorenzo perfected was also, simultaneously, a system of influence, not crude influence, not the influence of the censor or the soldier, the influence of the person who decides what gets made, what gets remembered, and what gets called great. Begin with a question that the history of the Renaissance almost never asks directly. Who did not get patronage? The record of the Medici as patrons is a record of extraordinary generosity toward an extraordinary group of people. Brunelleschi, Donatello, Botticelli, Michelangelo, Ficino, Poliziano, Pico. The names are so consistently brilliant that it is easy to read the list as evidence of pure discernment. A family so attuned to excellence that excellence was naturally drawn to them. But there was no open market for artistic or intellectual talent in 15th century Florence. There was no gallery system, no publishing industry, no mechanism by which a painter or a philosopher could reach an audience without the mediation of a patron. If you had no patron, you had no career. If you had no career, you produced nothing that survived. If you produced nothing that survived, history has no record of you. The Medici did not decide who was talented, but they decided, to a very significant degree, whose talent the world would remember. That is not the same as censorship. It does not require malice or even conscious intent. It requires only the exercise of preference, repeated over decades, in a system where preference is the only mechanism that matters. Walk with this for a moment. Ficino sits in the house that Cosimo provided, surrounded by the manuscripts that the Medici collected, in conversation with other scholars that the Medici gathered, translating texts that the Medici chose to acquire. He is not told what to think. No one stands over his shoulder and directs his conclusions. He is free, in the most genuine sense available to a scholar of his era and his dependents, to follow the argument wherever it leads, and where it leads, consistently and with genuine intellectual sophistication, is to conclusions that validate the world in which he is working. The philosophy he produces argues that wealth used to create beauty is not vanity but virtue, that the merchant who builds libraries and supports scholars is expressing the highest capacities of human nature. That Florence, with its commercial energy and its cultural ambition, represents a genuine realization of the best that human civilization can achieve. He was not insincere. The historical evidence does not support that conclusion. He believed what he wrote with the conviction of a man who had spent his life thinking carefully about difficult questions, but he was thinking inside a room that someone else had furnished. The texts on his shelves were there because Cosimo had bought them. The questions he was asking were the questions that the intellectual environment of the academy made central. The framework of assumptions within which his philosophy operated had been built, over decades, by the same family whose values and position his philosophy happened to confirm. This is not a conspiracy. It is something more ordinary and more pervasive than a conspiracy. It is how influence works when it is working at its most sophisticated level. Not by commanding conclusions, but by arranging conditions. Not by telling people what to think, but by building the room in which they think. Stocking it with certain books and certain conversations and certain questions, and then stepping back and allowing the people inside it to arrive, by their own reasoning, at conclusions that serve the interests of those who built the room. Now look at Botticelli. Sandro Botticelli spent most of his career producing work for the Medici and for clients connected to the Medici network. The Birth of Venus, Primavera, The Adoration of the Magi, in which members of the Medici family appear as participants in a biblical narrative. These works are among the greatest achievements of Western painting. They are also, in their iconography and their intended audience, products of a very specific cultural project. In the 1490s, when Savonarola rose to power in Florence and the Medici fell, Botticelli went through what his contemporaries described as a religious crisis. He stopped painting mythological subjects. He returned to strictly devotional Christian imagery. He may, according to some accounts, have destroyed some of his own earlier work. Whether or not those accounts are accurate, they point to something real. The cultural framework that had given Botticelli the permission and the audience for his greatest work was not universal. It was specific to a particular moment, a particular city, a particular set of values that a particular family had worked for decades to establish as the natural order of things. When that family fell, the framework fell with them, and the artist who had worked inside it found himself in a world that no longer recognized the language he had spent his career learning to speak. This is what the end of patronage looks like from the inside. Now raise the question that this chapter has been building toward, given the strategic calculation underneath the cultural generosity, given the way the system shaped what was made and what was remembered. Given the philosophy that validated the patrons and the art that placed their faces in biblical narratives, does it change anything? Does knowing that the Medici used culture as an instrument alter the value of what the culture produced? Is the birth of Venus less beautiful because it was painted inside a system designed, among other things, to make the Medici name synonymous with the highest achievements of human civilization? This film will not answer those questions for you, not because they are unanswerable, but because the answers depend on what you believe about the relationship between intention and achievement, between the uses of beauty and its value, between the world that produces a great work and the work itself. What this film will say is this: the Medici system was not simple. It was not pure generosity, and it was not pure manipulation. It was something more complicated than either description can capture. Something that the modern world has inherited so completely that we rarely step back far enough to see it clearly. Every university named after its donor, every museum wing that bears a family's name, every foundation that funds the arts, while also funding the ideas that justify the concentration of wealth that makes such foundations possible. All of it is operating inside a logic that was first made fully visible, first operated at sufficient scale and with sufficient sophistication to become a model. In 15th century Florence, the question of whether that logic is generous or strategic, whether it serves culture or uses it, is not a question with a clean answer. It is the question, and it is still open. Chapter 5. The Fire That Proved the Theory. In the autumn of 1494, Piero de' Medici rode out of Florence to meet Charles VIII of France. He went without authorization from the Florentine government. He went without consulting the councils that were supposed to govern the Republic, in which his family had operated for 60 years as private citizens, technically subject to the same civic structures as everyone else, technically holding no more formal authority than any other wealthy Florentine merchant. He went because he had grown up watching his father resolve political crises through personal intervention and had concluded, without examining the conclusion carefully enough, that the intervention itself was the method rather than the man. What he offered Charles, in exchange for the French army's peaceful passage through Florentine territory, was the surrender of several Florentine fortresses and the port of Livorno. He did not have the authority to make this offer. The fortresses and the port belonged to Florence, not to the Medici. When Piero returned and the terms of his agreement with Charles became known, the city did not accept them. The governing council refused to ratify what he had negotiated. When Piero attempted to enter the Palazzo della Signoria, the doors were closed against him. When he appealed to the people of Florence, the response he received was not the protective fury that had defended his father after the Pazzi conspiracy 16 years earlier. It was silence, and then, quickly, it was worse than silence. The Florentines, who had hanged an archbishop rather than accept the destruction of the Medici, now watched Piero flee the city he had mismanaged. Some of them attacked the Palazzo Medici. The collections that Cosimo and Lorenzo had spent decades assembling were looted or destroyed. The library was dispersed. The objects that had been the visible expression of 3 generations of cultural ambition were carried off by people who had, weeks earlier, been the beneficiaries of that ambition. How do we understand this? The Medici system, for all its sophistication and all the genuine beauty it produced, was not self-sustaining. It did not operate independently of the people who operated it. What Cosimo had built, and what Lorenzo had brought to its fullest expression, required continuous maintenance. The library had to keep acquiring books. The academy had to keep producing ideas. The festivals had to keep happening. The relationships had to keep being tended. The cultural life of the city had to keep feeling like something the Medici were contributing to rather than simply inheriting. None of this was automatic. All of it required the active engagement of someone who understood what the system was and what it demanded. Piero did not understand, and in the 2 years between his father's death and his own expulsion, Florence had begun to feel the difference. Not in a single dramatic moment, in the accumulated texture of daily life, in the small ways that a system shows its deterioration before it fails completely. Into this moment walked a Dominican friar from Ferrara named Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola had been preaching in Florence since 1490, initially at the invitation of Lorenzo himself, who had recognized that this was a voice worth having in the city. Lorenzo made the common mistake of brilliant and confident people who encounter a force they do not fully understand. He thought he could manage it. Savonarola was not manageable. He preached in the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore to crowds that grew. Over the course of 4 years, from hundreds to thousands, he was small, intense, with eyes that witnesses consistently described as burning. His voice was extraordinary, capable of moving between whisper and thunder in ways that reduced grown men to tears and sent women running from the church to avoid fainting. What he said was simple and devastating. Florence had lost its way, not militarily, not economically, spiritually. He said that the city that called itself the center of the civilized world had confused civilization with corruption, had mistaken the cultivation of earthly beauty for genuine virtue, had built magnificent churches and filled them with paintings of pagan gods and called this Christianity. He said that the wealth the Medici had poured into art and architecture and philosophy was not an expression of human dignity, but an expression of human vanity. That the Platonic Academy was a temple to pride, dressed in the language of theology. That the birth of Venus was not a celebration of beauty, but an offense against God. And he said that God was going to respond. He said this in 1491, more than a year before Charles VIII decided to invade Italy. And when the invasion came, when the most powerful military force in Europe moved through the peninsula with an ease that no one had anticipated, the people of Florence looked at Savonarola and heard something very difficult to argue against. They heard a man who had predicted exactly this in 1494, with Piero in exile and the French army in the territory and the city in genuine political crisis. Florence chose Savonarola. What followed is one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of Western culture. In February of 1497, and again in February of 1498, Savonarola organized what he called the bonfire of the vanities. The Florentines brought their things into the public squares: mirrors, cosmetics, musical instruments, books, including works of classical literature that Cosimo had spent fortunes acquiring, and Ficino had spent decades translating, and paintings. Some of them brought paintings, works produced under the very patronage system that had defined Florence's identity for 60 years. And they burned them. The bonfires were enormous. They were intended to be seen. They were theatre in the service of a theology that held that the beautiful things Florence had spent generations creating were impediments to salvation rather than expressions of it. Botticelli, by some accounts, may have brought paintings of his own to burn. The historical evidence is not conclusive, but the story persists because it captures something psychologically true about what Savonarola's Florence demanded of the people who had worked inside the Medici system. It demanded that they look at the things they had made at the height of their powers and see in them not achievement but sin. For 4 years, that demand found an audience. And then it didn't. Savonarola's political judgments began to appear less prophetic and more reckless as the crisis of the French invasion resolved without the apocalyptic consequences he had predicted. His relationship with Pope Alexander VI collapsed entirely when Savonarola began attacking the corruption of the papacy with the same ferocity he had directed at the Medici, which was theologically courageous and politically suicidal. His hold on the Florentine population began to fracture as the practical consequences of his governance became clear. Florence, under Savonarola, was a city that had rejected the cultural infrastructure that had made it significant, and the loss of that significance was beginning to be felt in ways that sermons could not address. In May of 1498, Savonarola was arrested, tried, and executed in the Piazza della Signoria, in almost exactly the spot where his bonfires had stood. Florence watched, and in the years that followed, something became visible that the bonfires had failed to destroy. The Medici were gone. Their collections were dispersed. Their palazzo had been looted. Their philosopher had died. Their sculptor had left for Rome. Their academy had ceased to function as an institution. And yet something remained. Not the objects, the disposition that had created them, the belief, planted so deeply, over 60 years of accumulated cultural investment, that Florence was a city where beauty mattered, where the life of the mind was worth taking seriously, where the cultivation of human capacity in all its dimensions was not a distraction from more important things, but was itself the most important thing. That belief had become part of how Florence understood itself. And a disposition, once it has become part of how a city understands itself, is extraordinarily difficult to destroy. Savonarola had attacked the objects. He had not been able to attack what the objects stood for, and what they stood for was still there, waiting, when the conditions that had produced them found their way back to Florence, which they did. In 1512, 18 years after Piero de' Medici had ridden out to meet Charles VIII without authorization and lost everything, the Medici returned to Florence. Chapter 6. The Resurrection. In the spring of 1513, a letter arrived in Rome that changed the direction of the Medici story in a way that even Cosimo could not have anticipated when he sat in his study in the Palazzo Medici half a century earlier and thought about what he was building. Why? The letter informed Giovanni de' Medici, 37 years old, second son of Lorenzo, the Magnificent, that he had been elected Pope. He would take the name Leo X. Stop with that fact for a moment. A family expelled from Florence 19 years earlier. A family whose palazzo had been looted, whose collections had been dispersed, whose name had been attached during the Savonarola years to everything that a city in the grip of religious fervour had decided to reject. A family of bankers and merchants, with no royal blood and no divine appointment, and no formal claim to any office higher than the ones available to any Florentine citizen of sufficient wealth and standing. That family now had a pope, not a Medici supporter in the papacy, not a Medici ally or a cardinal who owed the family a favour. A Medici, a man named Giovanni who had grown up in the Palazzo Medici, who had eaten at the table with Michelangelo and Ficino and Poliziano, who had spent the years of his family's exile moving through the courts of Europe with the specific combination of cultural sophistication and political patience that his upbringing had prepared him for, and who had arrived, after 19 years of waiting, at the most powerful office in the Christian world, the remark most frequently attributed to him on the occasion of his election, which may be accurate or may be the kind of thing that history invents for people it wants to characterize concisely, was this: God has given us the papacy. Let us enjoy it, whether he said it or not. The sentiment it expresses is recognizably Medici, not cynical in the way that critics preferred to read it, but honest, in the way that the Medici had always been honest, beneath their careful public surfaces, about the relationship between position and the good things that position makes possible. Leo X brought the Medici understanding to Rome. He hired Raphael to continue the decoration of the papal apartments. The rooms that Raphael completed during Leo's pontificate are among the supreme achievements of Renaissance painting, produced under the patronage of a man who had grown up, surrounded by the kind of cultural ambition that made such commissions feel natural rather than extravagant. He continued the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, the project that would, within a few years, produce the financial mechanism that gave Martin Luther his opening. The Protestant Reformation was not caused by Leo X or by the Medici. Its roots ran far deeper than any single pontificate, but the way Leo managed it, or rather the way he failed to manage it, was characteristic of a specific limitation that the Medici worldview had always carried without fully acknowledging. The Medici system worked brilliantly in conditions of relative stability. In environments where the players were sophisticated enough to understand that cultural influence and financial leverage were more effective instruments than force. It worked in Florence because Florence had developed the civic culture to appreciate what the Medici were offering. It worked in Rome, at least partially, because the papal court was an environment sufficiently sophisticated to value the kind of patronage that Leo provided. It did not work in the conditions that Luther created. Luther was not appealing to sophisticated courtiers who understood the calculus of cultural power. He was appealing to people who had been told that the church they were supposed to trust had become corrupt, that the indulgences they were being asked to purchase were a financial mechanism serving the ambitions of a Medici pope rather than the salvation of their souls. That kind of appeal does not respond to better art or more generous patronage. It responds to itself. Leo X died in 1521. He died having presided over some of the supreme achievements of Western art, and having failed to recognize until it was too late that the world in which those achievements made sense was in the process of ending. He was succeeded, after a brief interlude, by another Medici, Giulio de' Medici, illegitimate son of Giuliano. The Giuliano, who had died on the floor of Santa Maria del Fiore in 1478, became Pope Clement VII in 1523. The irony embedded in that genealogy is almost too precise to be accidental. The man murdered in the Pazzi conspiracy, whose death had seemed in the moment like the beginning of the end for the Medici, had fathered a pope. Clement commissioned Michelangelo to design the Medici Chapel and the Laurentian Library in Florence. The Medici Chapel contains the famous reclining figures of dawn, dusk, day, and night that surround the ducal tombs. They are not portraits. They are philosophical statements, meditations on time and mortality, and the relationship between human achievement and human limitation. They are among the most powerful sculptures ever made. They were commissioned to memorialize members of the Medici family who had not, in their own lifetimes, done much to merit such memorialization. And the sculptures are real. Their power is real. The experience of standing in that chapel today is real in a way that the political calculations that produced the commission are not. This is the paradox that the Medici story keeps returning to. The system was strategic. The beauty it produced was genuine. And the relationship between those two things cannot be resolved into a clean conclusion, because clean conclusions require separating things that were never actually separate. In May of 1527, an army of the Holy Roman Emperor, unpaid and out of control, entered Rome and sacked it. The city was looted for days. Churches were desecrated. The papal court, which had been the center of European cultural life for a generation, was destroyed as a functioning institution. Pope Clement VII, Giulio de' Medici, was held effectively prisoner while his city was ransacked. The Medici had survived the Pazzi conspiracy. They had survived exile and Savonarola and the bonfires. They had come back and produced 2 popes, and commissioned some of the greatest art of the century. But the Rome that emerged from the sack of 1527 was not the Rome that Leo had presided over. The confidence, the expansiveness, the sense that beauty and cultural achievement were the natural expressions of a civilization at its height. That sensibility which the Medici had carried from Florence to Rome and which had defined the High Renaissance did not survive 1527 intact. Europe was entering a different era, an era of religious conflict and doctrinal rigidity and the hardening of boundaries that had previously been porous. The world in which a family of merchants could transform itself into the center of Western civilization through the patient accumulation of cultural influence was not gone. But it was becoming more complicated, more contested, more resistant to the specific instruments that the Medici had perfected. In Florence, the Medici returned to power for the 3rd time in 1530. Alessandro de' Medici became the first Duke of Florence in 1532, transforming what had always been, at least nominally, a republican system into a formal hereditary duchy. This was the end of something, not the end of the Medici. The family would rule Florence as dukes and grand dukes for another 2 centuries, producing patrons of genuine ability, including Cosimo I, who rebuilt the Medici art collection and founded the Uffizi Gallery, whose descendants would eventually fill it with works that draw millions of visitors every year. But it was the end of the specific thing that made the early Medici historically remarkable. The early Medici had operated without formal power. They had built their position through influence rather than authority, constructed a system in which the distinction between the family's interests and Florence's interests was genuinely ambiguous because Cosimo and Lorenzo had worked so hard to make it ambiguous. The Medici dukes had the title and the military force and the legal standing that their ancestors had always technically lacked, and they were, by most historical accounts, less interesting, not because power made them worse people, but because the specific genius of Cosimo and Lorenzo was precisely the genius of operating without formal power, of building influence so deep and so genuine that it did not require the support of titles or armies, of making the distinction between the family's will and the city's freely chosen direction genuinely difficult to draw. Once you have the title and the army, that genius has nowhere to go. Cosimo de' Medici, Pater Patriae, who returned from exile in 1434 and spent the next 30 years making himself the soul of a city without ever calling himself its ruler, was something rarer than a duke. He was the proof that in the right conditions, with the right understanding of how power actually works, a man with no formal authority can build something more durable than anything formal authority can construct. That proof did not require the Medici duchy to remain valid. It only required Florence. And Florence, whatever happened to its government, remained for centuries afterward the city that Cosimo had made it. The city where beauty was taken seriously, the city where the life of the mind was understood as a civic achievement rather than a private luxury, the city where the name Medici, whatever complicated feelings it produced in those who examined its history carefully, remained inseparable from the idea that a civilization could be shaped, deliberately and systematically, by people who understood that the most lasting power was not the power to command. It was the power to define what a civilization remembered about its best self. Return to Florence. Every year, approximately 16 million people travel there from every country on Earth. They come to stand beneath Brunelleschi's dome. They come to the Uffizi to stand in front of the birth of Venus and feel something they would have difficulty articulating precisely, but that they traveled thousands of miles to feel. They come to the Medici chapel to stand before the figures of dawn and dusk and night and day. And the room does to them what great rooms always do. It makes them feel that human beings are capable of more than the ordinary texture of their lives usually suggests. They do not come for the banking records. They do not come to study the branch network or the risk management principles or the letter of credit systems. They come for the beauty. And that is exactly what Cosimo intended. Not these specific visitors, not this specific era, but this specific outcome that the name Medici would be inseparable for as long as the objects survived, from the experience of encountering the highest achievements of human creativity. The objects survived. The outcome was achieved. But this film has been arguing from its opening minutes that the Medici story does not end in 15th century Florence, that the logic they operated by has continued, in different forms and under different names, in every era since. Not because anyone consciously copied them, but because the logic itself is sound enough to be rediscovered independently by anyone who accumulates enough resources to ask the question that Cosimo was among the first in his world to answer seriously: what is the most durable thing money can build? Not a fortress. Fortresses fall. Not a fleet. Fleets are sunk or made obsolete. Not a title. Titles are revoked or rendered meaningless by the passing of the systems that granted them. The answer Cosimo arrived at was this: the most durable thing wealth can construct is a civilization's image of itself. Fund the things a city is proud of. Attach your name to the best version of what a community believes it can be. And you have built something that outlasts the money, outlasts the politics, outlasts the specific historical moment in which it was constructed. Look at any institution in the world today that funds museums, universities, libraries, arts programs, or public memory of any kind. Ask the question this film has been asking since a Sunday morning in April of 1478. Not, are they being generous? But what are they building? And who will be remembered for having built it? The dome is still there. Brunelleschi's dome stands over Florence today as it has stood for nearly 6 centuries. It is visible from almost every point in the city. It defines the skyline in a way that nothing built since has managed to diminish. When the light falls on it, in the late afternoon, in the specific quality of Tuscan light that painters have been trying to capture since the 1400s, it looks less like a building than like a fact, like something that was always going to be there and simply required someone to see it clearly enough to build it. Cosimo de' Medici helped pay for it. The banking records are in archives that specialists visit. The name Medici is on the lips of 16 million people a year who travel to Florence to stand beneath something impossible and feel, for a moment, that human beings are capable of more than the ordinary texture of their lives usually suggests. That was the investment. That was the return, and the question of whether it was generosity or strategy, whether it was love of beauty or love of power, whether the two can ever be separated in the mind of someone capable of both simultaneously. That question does not have an answer that this film can give you. It has an answer that you will spend the rest of your life working out. The dome is still there. Draw your own conclusions.